All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our third webinar in a series on apprenticeships. We're really excited to have you here with us to learn more specifically about youth apprenticeships today. If you haven't done so already, I want to encourage you to say hi in the chat box with your name, organization, and where you're joining us from. If you don't know who I am, I'm Rachel Bruns. I'm the Chief Engagement Officer at America's Service Commissions, also referred to as ASK. We are the National Association for the 52 governor-designated state service commissions, which administer AmeriCorps state programs throughout the country, as well as promote volunteering and service in their respective states and territories. We have been partnering with the Department of Labor and AmeriCorps in hosting these webinars specific to apprenticeship. And we're excited to wrap up the series today to learn more specifically about youth apprenticeships from Urban Institute. As I shared on the two previous webinars, I want to remind folks that as we're learning and talking about apprenticeships, we're often going to hear language that is specific to employment and employers. And I want to encourage all of us on the webinar that are representing the national service field, like state service commissions and AmeriCorps programs, to kind of do that translation on your own from employee to, say, an AmeriCorps member or service member, and from employer to service site or your organization. So we can do that translation on our end, but just recognize our presenters may be using employee and employer type language. So with that, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters today, Robert Lerman and Deborah Cobbs from Urban Institute, who are going to be talking with us about the work they do and share a little bit more about youth apprenticeship specifically. So Robert, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to introduce yourself further.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Bob Lerman. I'm an Institute Fellow at Urban Institute, and I'm also chairman of the board of a nonprofit called Apprenticeships for America, and been working on trying to expand apprenticeship in the United States for a number of decades, and glad to see that America is turning its attention to apprenticeship and trying to, in a way, maybe catch up with some of our competitors in other countries where apprenticeship is far more robust and far more of a real option for young people. But I thought I would start with a few points about why it's a big, could you move the slide, please? Why it's a key moment and why apprenticeship is drawing interest again. I think these are some of the key reasons that we know how expensive the what I call academic only approach, meaning staying in school as long as you can and then looking for a job. A lot of students fall out of that process. And then even those that remain, there are a lot of skill mismatches, even among people that do graduate. There's a continuing recognition that a lot of learning takes place best outside of the school environment. We're also realizing that other countries have very robust systems, and that leads to a direction for almost all their young people. And I always find this number quite striking, that 95% of Swiss 25-year-olds have either a BA or have done an apprenticeship. They have a lower BA rate than the US and a higher per capita income than the US. So it's a modern approach as well as a traditional approach. It also widens the opportunities for those who learn best by doing. And finally, it's one of the few areas that is attracting bipartisan political support. Next slide. So it's important to know exactly what we're talking about. You may have seen a lot of this before, but I like to lay it out, and feel free to use this slide in explaining apprenticeship to others, that apprenticeship it's fundamentally about learning, but it is a job with structured work-based learning under a mentor, requires written agreements between the employers, the apprentices. They know what they're getting into, what they have to fulfill. Key to the point, many times people use the term earning and learning, but it's really earning, producing, and learning, because the apprentices are contributing to production as they learn. Ideally, we have occupational frameworks that are well developed. In the US, we don't always have that. We have sort of individual program competency standards, or what are sometimes called work process schedules, that lay out the skills that apprentices are going to try to master. Key is the point that when you complete, you have a certification that specifies that you are a fully qualified worker in a particular occupation. Now, registered apprenticeships are specifically those programs that are sanctioned by state or federal offices. There are a number of unregistered apprenticeship programs, but we haven't done the research to determine exactly how many there are. In the registered apprenticeship program language, we call a program something called a sponsor occupation combination. Now, a sponsor can be an individual employer, a group of employers, a union management committee. Could even be a training organization, could become a sponsor. The sponsor is responsible for getting the program registered, for making sure that the employers follow all of the provisions of that plan on occupational skill development and related instruction. Next slide, please. So now that we know what's it good for, I think it's good for a lot of things. In particular, for the workers themselves, learning by doing is a very effective way of learning. You're learning concepts in the context of how they apply. And as a result, you are working in a real environment. You need to produce, as I mentioned before. Doing that helps you gain maturity and the kind of employability skills that firms are looking for. Now, the gains in earnings come without any student debt. Typically, the employer, or there's some other way that you pay for the off-job learning. And the on-the-job learning is certainly absorbed by the employer. So you see increases in earnings, and we have documented that in our evaluation of the American Apprenticeship Initiative, which we can refer you to the papers on that evaluation later. Another point is the incentive of the apprentices to perform well in the classes. The mentors are keeping a close eye on apprentices, making sure they keep up with their classes, and if they fail or they just don't show up, they often lose that apprenticeship and the opportunity for skill development and for economic mobility. Unlike most education and training programs, apprentices experience little or no lost foregone earnings. Foregone earnings is a term economists use to indicate that one of the costs of being in school is that you could have spent that time earning money, and that is as a cost an implicit cost to the participant. And finally, despite what some say, apprentices retain most of what they learn for decades. When you switch jobs, you often switch to an adjacent job, and what you've been learning in the apprenticeship is quite relevant. Next slide, please. Now, another great thing about apprenticeship is it is a potentially win-win situation, win-win for the employer and for the worker. And one reason is the close match between the content of the training and what employers are really looking for. So you don't have this distance between the employer and some educational organization that might have an advisory group, but it's not the same as being directly involved in the learning process, in the training process. Another thing about apprenticeships from the employer standpoint is that they're learning occupational skills, but in the context of the employer's organization. And so there's no subsequent onboarding that you need to do. The apprentices learn how it's being done within that organization, how various tasks required are being done in the organization. Employers report that apprenticeships tend to reduce turnover and recruitment, and as I say, ensure the skills are relevant. Another thing that makes apprenticeships valuable to companies is that companies, when they have enough skilled workers, even when demand increases, they can meet the demand because they have a set of people that can go into the high skill positions when economic conditions merit. Apprenticeships often are a way of upgrading people within the organization. And as this last slide highlights, it helps promote the idea that the employer organization, it's a learning organization, and it tends to be an increase in morale. And in fact, when we interviewed a large number of companies and we asked them a whole series of questions about it, what we would call indirect benefits, we found that most companies viewed almost all of these indirect benefits as relevant to their program, including increasing the productivity of coworkers. So you're increasing the productivity of the worker himself or herself and increasing the productivity of coworkers. Next slide. Finally, for me, apprenticeship does yield dividends for the government. Our current system, in the hundreds of billions of dollars, preparing workers for careers, mainly through post-secondary education, whether they be community colleges, four-year colleges, private colleges. It fails many, leaves a lot of skill gaps. We all know about the student debt. It's a huge drain on the Treasury and of state budgets as well. But with apprenticeship, the main cost is the starting costs, where you do very retail marketing with employers, help them organize their programs. And once you do that, you're very likely to leverage a whole flow of training services over time. So much of the cost of learning the profession is borne by the employer. Now, the employer gets a return because of the work of the apprentices, but it means that the government does not have to pay for most of the costs. Government should pay for the off-job learning because that's a very general skill development process that whose benefits go well beyond the apprenticeship in that employer. But just to give you a feeling about the difference between apprenticeships and things like other training programs. In the other training programs, you have to pay every year for the training slot. You have to pay for the instructors, the space, and every year you're continuing to have to pay for that. In the case of apprenticeship, there's an initial upfront cost on the selling and organizing with employers. But once employers adopt apprenticeship, most of them continue to use apprenticeships and expand the range of training and learning in the country. And much of that is, as I say, not a cost to the government. So when Washington State and others have looked at what's the return to government investments in apprenticeship, and these investments tend to be small, you see very high ratios of benefits relative to cost. So I'll now turn it over to Deborah Kobus, who will talk more directly about the side of apprenticeship.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you all for having me. So I'm Deborah Kobus. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. Like Bob, I focus primarily on apprenticeship. And I realized as we're having this discussion that I actually want to start by going off script for a second, just to talk about apprenticeship for young people, how that relates to youth apprenticeship, what is and isn't youth apprenticeship. And just sort of provide some general background before jumping into some content that hopefully is more useful to you all in a narrower sense. So as Bob mentioned, sort of compared it to international examples, there's not a lot of youth apprenticeship in the United States. The average age of a starting age for apprentices is somewhere around 26. It's actually slightly younger than it used to be, but it's still older than any sort of definition that you would use for youth apprenticeship. And so there's been a recent trend and a recent effort on the part of the federal government and state and local leaders, apprenticeship leaders, to really pull the apprenticeship system into the youth space. But there's not actually consensus around what a youth apprenticeship would look like per se. So right now we're in a space where there's a lot of variety in terminology, and honestly, you can kind of pick and choose what makes the most sense for your context. So youth apprenticeship, initially, I think the momentum was really around designing programs that start in high schools and may extend beyond a high school period. Some of those exist within the registered apprenticeship system, some of those exist outside of it, but really using secondary to post-secondary transitions and secondary to employment transitions as the sort of core of the design for youth apprenticeship. One of the challenges with that is that for people who are out of school and out of work, this creates another potential divide in terms of opportunities for economic access, right? We already have a lot of people who are poorly served by the educational system. We have a lot of people who are excluded from good jobs and economic opportunity. We don't want another system, another pathway to really be designed without these folks in mind, right? And so as youth apprenticeship has been evolving as a concept, you do sometimes now also see it applying more broadly, really just to be specifically about designing programs for youth and really just looking at age as opposed to an institutional anchor. There's not resolution yet about sort of what the federal definition of youth apprenticeship will end up being, whether others will use that same definition. So right now, I think it's just at a very basic level, I personally appreciate the value of the registered apprenticeship system. There's a quality and consistency and everything that Bob described. We really know the outcomes that come through this structure. There is value to designing a program specifically around the needs of young people and where they are in life. So my sort of personal preference for youth apprenticeship definition is a program that's designed with young people in mind, but exists within the registered apprenticeship system. Also, any funding that is designated for apprenticeship currently will be designated through the registered apprenticeship system. And so it is important to really navigate the registered apprenticeship system. And that's the basis for conversation here. So that's kind of a side background note heading into all of this. And then the other thing I will say is, even though the average age is older for apprenticeships, there's nothing excluding anyone 16 or above from joining an existing apprenticeship program. So some of the data that I'll be referring to here really is actually just looking at any young person that's in any registered apprenticeship program and what the trends are. Now, even as we have these programs that are designed specifically for young people, there's no sort of automatic field in the data sets or easy way to sort of separate and designate those programs. So it's a little bit harder to tease out the impact of programs that are designed specifically for young people on registered apprenticeships overall. So that's my large set of background and caveats. And then I really wanted to just sort of jump in and think about serving young people that aren't in high school. That seemed like the most relevant sort of descriptor here. So just to start off, really looking at how do young people do that are entering registered apprenticeship programs? For the most part, just based on the size of the system and the numbers and the fact that these high school-based programs are recent and they're still really launching and growing, the numbers are very small. Most of the data that we have around young people in apprenticeship is just about 16 to 24-year-olds who aren't connected to high school or post-secondary. And what we see here is that there's the same lack of diversity and equity gaps that you see in the registered apprenticeship system overall. So women still are a very small percentage of apprentices. There's still a wage gap there. You actually see that young Black apprentices are less represented in the system than in the apprenticeship system overall. So at this point, you're now starting to see about the same representation for Black apprentices and Black workers overall, but for young people, they're still underrepresented in the system. And then you see these challenges around completion, large wage gaps, by different demographic groups. And so there really still is this need to really center the expansion of apprenticeship on equitable designs and being more inclusive. Some of the reasons for that is the same kind of occupational segregation and discrimination that you'd see in the broader workforce, right? As Bob was saying, these are jobs. So you're not going to sort of magically escape the discrimination of the American labor force by focusing on the apprenticeship side. And there is, especially by gender, a lot of occupational segregation. And so the traditional registered apprenticeship system is very heavily in the construction trades. We're now expanding into a wider range of occupations, but you see women more likely to enter things like pharmacy tech roles that don't pay nearly as much. The second challenge is that there's not really the same sort of scaled systems in place to serve out of school youth, right? So for in-school youth, as we're trying to launch and expand, at least we know that there are school districts, there are post-secondary institutions that really operate at scale. Often it's harder when youth are disengaged from both school and work. It's harder to identify them and then serve them. And that's actually sort of, I think, a systemic challenge, but a reason I'm so excited to talk to all of you is because you have an opportunity for scale that is, I think, rare overall and something really to lean into. And then the final challenge is really just that young people are coming with a really wide range of academic attainment. Some might already know what careers they want. Others might not have been exposed to many career opportunities at all. So they're in very different stages of career exploration. And so there's just a lot of a really wide range of differences that need to be accommodated within programs that are designed for out of school youth. When you think of a more typical apprentice who's an older worker, they
are much more likely to already know exactly why they're pursuing that specific occupation and have a long-term occupational goal in mind. Whereas for young people, this might be career exploration as much as it is a long-term commitment to that job. Next slide, please. So I got all the challenges out of the way so I could focus on the good stuff. And I think there's a lot of really great benefits to thinking about registered apprenticeship for out-of-school youth. So one, just to note, is with the exception of a small dip during COVID, there's really been a lot of growth of young people in the system. So there are about twice as many apprentices between the ages of 16 and 24 now as there were about a decade ago. So we really are seeing that there is truly potential here, and there's that opportunity in the long term to build a system that is a scaled system. For a lot of us, ultimately, we're trying to get people to economic stability. So the wages are really important here. The average wage of a young person in a registered apprenticeship is $31 an hour. And that compares to an average of $13 an hour for all working young people. And so there's a substantial difference in income here as potential. And that's in part, again, because if you look at the traditional occupations that are in the registered apprenticeship system, many of them are higher paying jobs. And so this creates an access point to those high wage industries, not just a high wage for a short term program. The second value is that, again, for people who, may or may not have a high school degree, may or may not hope to return to post-secondary education, registered apprenticeship has that related instruction embedded within its design. And so this can create a pathway back to a post-secondary opportunity. So it could be just an industry recognized credential or something else that's short-term and completely contained within the apprenticeship program. It could also be an on-ramp into a 2-year or a 4-year post-secondary degree. And so increasingly registered apprenticeships are actually being delivered for academic credit, and sometimes are even degree-bearing programs in and of themselves. And so there's that possibility of not only connecting to further career opportunities, but also to further educational opportunities, again, depending on the sort of career desires and interests of the young person. And then finally, there's just a wider range of occupations that you can do registered apprenticeship for than you used to be able to do, right? And so as we actually look at the expanded range of occupations and we think about sort of hot spots and investments in the economy right now, clean energy, green jobs, and then STEM related fields, tech fields, these are all things where registered apprenticeship is growing. So next slide, please. And so I think, thinking about that opportunity for young people overall, there are really some clear reasons why service learning organizations align with registered apprenticeship. Like I mentioned earlier, one is just that there's a scale and a consistency in service learning programs that is more readily available and accessible than you get in a lot of other programs for out of school youth that are much more, localized and community based and are great, but that really make sort of scaling up economic opportunity more of a challenge. The second thing is just the fact that your service learning programs are really in-depth opportunities. So if you think about a pre-apprenticeship program, those usually are at least a few months long. If a young person has more academic skills that they would need to gain, or sort of general career awareness and learning before they would be ready to be an apprentice, then the fact that these programs are longer, you can interweave some of these technical competencies of a pre-apprenticeship in with a longer term program, and that works quite well. Also, you see registered apprenticeship programs, they have to be at least 1 year. If you think about your typical old school apprenticeship program that was like in the construction trades, those were 4 to 6 years. But now you see in a lot of these other occupations and more registered apprenticeships that are 12 to 18 months long. And so you can really actually use the structure of a service learning program for the entirety of an apprenticeship program, or you can use it as the launch pad for a longer term program. And so the in-depth nature of service learning and registered apprenticeship really align and differ from a lot of other really short-term job training programs. And then finally, on-the-job learning, as Bob was discussing, is really central to the design of registered apprenticeships. And so having the structured employment or volunteer opportunities or other really sort of work experience components of service learning tie in very much to the idea that apprentices are productive workers who are gaining skills by having real responsibilities in a real workplace. And then the final thing is that none of this can really happen without robust employer partnerships. Employers are the ones hosting apprentices, paying apprentices, trying to really build the loyalty of apprentices as a long-term workforce. And so some of the challenge with a lot of job training programs is they're sort of pumping skilled workers out into the world without a clear place for them to land. But for those folks who are already working with employers, it's creating that bridge that's really necessary for registered apprenticeship. And so that's a really huge asset in terms of getting involved in registered apprenticeship. And the final thing I'll actually note here is a slight side note, but if you looked at how the apprenticeship system grew in the past, it really was through individual employers. In the past decade, the federal government has turned more to the use of intermediaries. And so you actually do have more and more program sponsors who aren't necessarily the employer of record. They're not the one who's physically hosting the apprentice and paying the apprentice in their site. It is an intermediary who's working with multiple employers to really design and launch the programs. And so with that shift in emphasis in the system, it also creates more space for service learning organizations to really be central to the design and delivery of apprenticeship programs. So that's all the sort of broad stuff. Yeah, next slide, please. I just want to jump in a little bit to what this has looked like already. So most of the energy around aligning the registered apprenticeship system and service year programs has happened in the pre-apprenticeship space. And so these are I'm sure you all have more examples, but I would say these are kind of my anchor points for looking at where the activity has been. Youth Build is the first one. If you look at the language, authorizing Youth Build, it is actually considered to be a pre-apprenticeship program. Historically, that hasn't actually meant that there have been actual ties to the registered apprenticeship system. It's been a sort of conceptual definition, if you will. And so in the late 2000s, the National Building Trades Unions created the multi-craft core curriculum, which is a general overview of all of the different construction trades. And it's designed really to be an on-ramp into each of their different apprenticeship programs. And so they worked quite a bit with Youth Build to pilot the use of that pre-apprenticeship program within Youth Build programs around the country. And so that started to create this alignment between Youth Build pre-apprenticeships and real live actual registered apprenticeship programs. Then in the mid 2010s, that's just as the registered apprenticeship system is expanding out to other occupations, Youth Build also was looking beyond its building trades training. And so they have this whole class of programs, Construction Plus programs, that are not only in construction, but in a range of other occupations. And so they started to pilot what pre-apprenticeship programs would look like and how to align with registered apprenticeship programs there. I would say a lot of this has been site specific, and then there's sort of centralized technical assistance to help build the capacity of local programs who are interested, but it hasn't really happened on a systems-wide level across Youth Build. In the Job Corps programs in 2022 really sort of took a jump forward all at once, formalizing the alignment between over 300 of their existing programs with registered apprenticeship programs. And so this really did span that full range of different industries and really mapped Job Corps programs directly up to registered apprenticeship programs. And then finally, the core network has a lot of interest in green programs and issues of climate change. So they began by launching this pre-apprenticeship program in coordination with a national industry association. So that's a registered apprenticeship program that's scaling so that different locations could offer the same pre-apprenticeship program and have that consistency across the organization. And then they're looking to see how to expand lessons from that into other pre-apprenticeship opportunities. All of these programs, I will say I've had conversations with, especially at a local level, different local either partners with youth builds and partners with Job Corps, or others who are really interested in exploring registered apprenticeship opportunities as well. But the sort of high level way that they've most deeply engaged with the registered apprenticeship system has been in pre-apprenticeship. So next slide. And it's sort of all culminating with AmeriCorps and many of you on the call, I'm sure. But there are examples from AmeriCorps that have spanned both the pre-apprenticeship and then the actual apprenticeship space. So the Urban Technology Project in Philadelphia, I find to be really exciting for a couple of reasons. One is it's with the Philadelphia public school system. I think there's a lot of opportunity to really look at the public sector. That's a way to get to large scale employment opportunities that are quality jobs that come with benefits. But also, this is a program where when I was, sort of early on background talking about the difference between programs that are designed for high school students and those that are designed for out of school youth, the Urban Technology Project spans both in-school and out-of-school youth. And so the in-school youth are part of the Computer Support Specialists IT program. And then AmeriCorps participants begin as digital service fellows, as pre-apprentices. So there's this sort of full pathway of people who are coming in through different roads, on-ramps, but can be engaged in this larger system, getting to similar career opportunities. And then secondly, the Colorado Public Health Works, and I saw somebody on here from Colorado, so hopefully you'll speak up in the discussion, but is I think the first example of a registered apprenticeship program that's working directly with AmeriCorps participants to be the apprentices, and really shows again that you can have a registered apprenticeship program integrated in with AmeriCorps, and it's reaching some of these non-traditional occupations. So that I think is a great sort of place to think about where we are as a country right now. The possibility is there. We have these early examples of evidence that this alignment really works. But we're still sort of experimenting and piloting what these apprenticeship programs can look like, and then looking for forums like this as well to think about how we can translate that into a more consistent and scaled approach to youth apprenticeships. So that is the crux of my remarks. I'll just close briefly with a couple resources. So the Urban Institute has a variety of apprenticeship projects, but the Youth Apprenticeship Intermediary Project is a good starting point with resources that are youth specific. The Registered Apprenticeship Standards Library is our centralized source of information for those existing programs that are out there. The description of what skills and competencies you would gain on the job. So those are called work process schedules, as well as outlines for the related instruction. So it's sort of all of the meat of what you would need in order to submit something as a new program. And so that's a way to sort of see what the best thinking and most current thinking in a number of these occupations are. And then finally, if you're thinking about from a sort of practical level, what it takes to design and then implement and manage a youth apprenticeship program, that last link, that's the roadmap, could be really helpful. So we are available, both Bob and I and our teams are available to really help people think through what it would look like to launch a program at the local level. So please feel free to follow up with us with any questions. And I look forward to the discussion here and hearing from all of you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks, Bob, for sharing. I see, Kathy, the question about adding the links in the chat. I can do that in a minute. I'm sharing my screen right now, so I can't copy and add it, but I can definitely do that. in a moment. I'll also email all of the slides recording from today. And for those of you that have access to our Basecamp groups, we'll share all the links and materials there as well. So if anyone does have any questions or comments for our presenters today, feel free to share those in the chat, or you're also welcome to raise your hand and come off mute and ask questions over audio as well. So we'll pause a moment and see what questions folks have.
I'll just add one, Bob Lerman here, I'll just add one set of links that might be worthwhile for people, and that is there were about 10 papers relating to the evaluation of the American Apprenticeship Initiative. If you just Google Urban Institute AAI or Google Urban Institute American Apprenticeship Initiative, they are full papers are on the ETA library.
Great, good to know. Thank you, Bob. I see Kathy, who's with Serve Nebraska, has her hand raised. Kathy, do you want to share your question?
Yeah, thank you very much for this webinar. What I ask is, I have been to numerous locations across the state of Nebraska to talk about this type of stuff, apprenticeships, and how it can braid funding with AmeriCorps. Suggestions, I'm getting nowhere. My commissioners are more excited about this than Department of Labor, Goodwill, United Way, any of those folks. Any thoughts from your corners of how I can you know, get some excitement going in this area?
Can I ask real quickly, when you say get excitement going, are you talking about like from whom? From other potential partners, from employers? Where are you sort of running into resistance?
Well, it's just not necessarily resistance. It is, well, for instance, the apprenticeship person with the Department of Labor is like, well, we don't do anything here. We have to get approval from our federal agency. And if they haven't written it up, then we don't do it. Okay, well, who has apprenticeships? Well, we can't really tell you that in the state of Nebraska. So do you have colleges or universities that do this? Well, yeah, but we can't really share that information with you. So it's just, it's like,
that's very inappropriate because I believe a lot of this can be done through apprenticeship.gov. If you go on apprenticeship.gov and you go to resources, well, actually, you can go to, if you go to resources, you can find occupation finder, partner finder, list your apprenticeship jobs. I see it does mention our evaluation. And if you go under resources and apprenticeship tools to data and statistics, it tells you, at least as reported by the states, not always correctly, but the number of apprentices and the number of programs by where they live. Looking it up, seems to indicate that there are about 4,068 apprenticeships in Nebraska. So I think a lot of that material is available on the website. I would say, in answer to your question about funding and the use of AmeriCorps funding, I don't see any. You know, this is maybe AmeriCorps might have a problem with it, but when you well, let me back up. One of the areas of apprenticeship we're trying to pursue now are apprenticeships in government employment. So if you start working with an agency that has vacancies, let's say a maintenance department in a high school, presumably you could use some of the funding for the AmeriCorps to pay for part of the wages, and you could sort of tie together a number of things there. It is true that a lot of times the apprenticeship training representatives are not very well staffed, and as a result, what has been happening is that there are a lot of intermediary organizations that try to go out and recruit employers. Now, I don't know what qualifies as being exactly an AmeriCorps volunteer. They do get stipends, correct, Kathleen?
Yeah, typically for a full-time AmeriCorps position, they receive a living stipend. So there definitely are ways to kind of braid the living stipend. And I think what some of our colleagues have kind of worked around this topic, specifically Serve Colorado, which was referenced, the Colorado program, is historically, I think one of the perceived barriers has been the need to kind of increase that stipend over time, because of the requirements with registered apprenticeship with having that kind of increase in wage. But that has been something
I think
able to
you know,
navigate.
you could probably try to get some sort of waiver. I think to the extent that it was limited, you could maybe get a waiver, or maybe what you could do is have whoever the volunteer is working for maybe top up. I don't know whether you allow a slight top up of the stipend. The wage progression is very flexible. It doesn't need to be a big increase. So there may be ways of topping it up. But I think it's potentially a very good tool, because the volunteer can not only be useful to the organization, whatever organization they're working for, but also gain occupational expertise in a particular field that will help them later on, not just the work experience itself. Of course, the volunteer experience is valuable and honorable. But I think if you can combine it with work-based learning toward an occupational high level of competence, I think you can promote that.
And just a couple quick things to add. So I was searching state apprenticeship expansion grants and pulled up a flyer that came up for Nebraska there. So just in terms of sort of who's allowed to do things versus who might have that enthusiasm for doing things. So I don't know if in your previous sessions you got into this, but half of states are state apprenticeship agency states, and half are federal office of apprenticeship states in terms of overseeing the registered apprenticeship system at a state level. But that really just is who's sort of in charge of approving standards. It doesn't mean that that's where the capacity sits to actually really build the programs. In some cases, those are really well-staffed agencies, and in other cases less so. But one of the ways that the federal government has been working to build capacity across all states is through these state apprenticeship expansion grants. So Nebraska is an example of one of these states that is an office of apprenticeship state. So the federal government is overseeing approval, but the state Department of Labor is who's receiving the state apprenticeship expansion grants in that case. And so they actually have program goals around launching new programs. They have, staff who are really tasked with helping register programs. And so you might find, even if it's not who would be sort of in a chart around approvals, that you'll find partners and allies who would be interested in really thinking through those design options and in launching new programs. And I think that's true in Nebraska, but also generally sort of looking at those state apprenticeship expansion grant opportunities. That's now a formula fund, so that'll be a fairly steady source of support in the coming years. And then on top of that, there are competitive grants that you can seek to partner with your state on to, this could be sort of part of a central design of the competitive grant proposals. And then similarly, there are a number of groups like Urban, where we're a youth apprenticeship intermediary. So we're really trying to go out there and launch programs for young people. There are 4 of us that are contractors. Urban is one. Under Bob's leadership, we've well outperformed our goals, and we have another year to really try to make that mark, right? So we want to be out there partnering with you, helping figure out how to get these programs started. And then there are similarly contracts that are industry based. So if there's a specific occupation that you're looking at, there are contractors who really have the expertise and know the standards and existing programs that can meet those needs. So those are another set of partners you could identify. And then the final thing I'll say is, when we think about those high school based apprenticeship programs, many of them, you start your junior or your senior year, the beginning of your apprenticeship program, you're still in school, but the apprenticeship program itself goes longer than while you're still in high school. I could imagine an AmeriCorps design that follows that same model, where the first year of your apprenticeship program, you're in AmeriCorps, but then you can continue on beyond AmeriCorps, and the apprenticeship program is longer than that. And then when you think about things like wage progression, you're getting the wage progression at the completion of AmeriCorps, and you don't have to build in the incremental increases during the life of the program. So there's a variety of ways that you can think about program design. It doesn't have to be that the AmeriCorps experience is entirely the same as the registered apprenticeship program.
Thank you so
So
much.
just
Great
one
information.
more thing is, we all are very aware that the biggest barrier to scaling apprenticeship in the United States is to get employers to offer apprenticeship slots. Now, to the extent that AmeriCorps is already working with a lot of employers, some employers are using AmeriCorps volunteers. Maybe those same employers are using regular workers for others. Engaging with those employers is a potential benefit of your existing apparatus, but it takes a lot of work to persuade employers to change their human resources policy, to change their hiring and training policy. A lot of them are not sure about apprenticeship, let alone registered apprenticeship. And often it takes several meetings. When we were able to create these apprenticeships, it takes a number of meetings to do it. But once you get them going, they do tend to continue.
Great. Well, I know we're just about at time, so I just want to give a huge thank you to Bob and Deborah for sharing about youth apprenticeships with us today, and really encourage folks to follow up with them with further questions. And it sounds like really great resources for those of you that are interested in developing youth apprenticeships within your respective states and communities. I know we have a lot of AmeriCorps programs in our network that are currently engaging young people between the ages of 16 to 25 in their programs. And so I do think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to have continued conversations and talk about how we can work together to build out youth apprenticeships through AmeriCorps. I do want to give a quick moment to Brent Kosick at Service here to share briefly about their Clean Energy Apprenticeship Project.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll be really brief, but yeah, we're really excited at Service Year Alliance. We're going to be partnering with the Interstate Renewable Energy Council under their new Apprenticeship and Clean Energy Network. It's funded by the Department of Labor Office of Apprenticeship. What this is all about is we'll be working with a group of partners to further leverage national service programming as a talent development pipeline into like quality clean energy apprenticeships. I guess bottom line, if your commission or your program would be interested in maybe scheduling a time for your core members to learn more about how to think about entering into apprenticeships in this area, please email me. I think Rachel's going to be sending a follow-up with my email, but I'll also put that in the chat. Also, if your commission or your program is thinking about hosting any career fairs for core members, we would also be interested in talking with you about how we could help support driving more clean energy employers into that space as well. So yeah, I'll post my email address, and thanks so much for the time.
Thanks, Brent. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll email all of the materials and recording from today out to everyone that registered, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Have a wonderful rest of your Friday. Bye, everyone.